In the queer community, it's common for individuals to conceal their true identities because of societal influences and expectations. In Dr. Daniel Pfau's case, who uses they/them pronouns, it went a step further. They grew up in a conservative bubble, so when they tried to open up about their sexual orientation, their counselor sent them to conversion therapy. But Dr. Pfau knew there was more out there than what their counselor was telling them. They wanted real answers, so they turned to science and began looking for the answers themselves. Dr. Pfau is a queer and genderqueer neuroscientist specializing in sex differences and endocrinology. And if you don't know what any of that means, don't worry. We're going to get into it. Today, Dr. Pfau is here to explain their discoveries about the history of queerness and what place the LGBTQ+ community has in the world of science.
I'm Dr. Daniel Pfau, and this is Pride.
Dr. Pfau grew up in sunny California, and from a young age, they were drawn to nature.
I just love being in nature and love watching just the animals and even just the plants blowing in the wind.
But they were interested in more than just the beauty of it. They wanted to know why it was here and what it came from.
How everything sort of grew and how everything sort of just looked in the way that it grew. And for me, that sort of translated really well into science in school.
Dr. Pfau began to realize that the community and the education system they were in was only going to cover the basics.
I had a very small sort of community of conservative individuals. So the things that drew me to science weren't necessarily things or topics that they were interested in talking about.
So they started looking for the answers themselves.
So when I was growing up, I would see in the natural world these things, these aspects of the natural world that didn't fit into what I was being told. So when I was being told there's men and women, and then I'd collect all these beetles, and these beetles would all stack up on each other and obviously be doing something that someone told me would only happen between a man and a woman. And I'm like, okay, well, 5 of these beetles now are on top of each other. Something else has to be going on.
But because Dr. Pfau was young and therefore viewed as naive, they were constantly battling it with know-it-all adults.
All the adults basically telling me that you don't know what you're talking about. Let us share with you what's the truth. And then me looking out in nature being like, okay, but wait a second, these two things aren't really sort of jiving together.
While on a school field trip, Dr. Pfau's fascination with sex and identity intensified.
We were looking at animals, and it was in the 5th grade, I think, and we had a biologist with us who was telling us about sex differences between males and females, but then sort of talking about how in some species they don't exist. And I just latched onto that idea and just was going all wonky and talking about it a bunch, and people were just entertained by it and to no end. And so I just was oh my goodness, okay, let me just keep talking about male and female and male and and people were giving me weird looks. And my dad was on the trip with us, and he was just mortified. I don't think he really knew exactly what was going on.
Dr. Pfau received pushback because of their passion for gender identity. No one in their community understood why they cared so much.
But like I said, I think a lot of individuals felt like I was sort of both connected to some weird sexual thing, as well as, my gender identity at the time not being comfortable identifying male, or at least expressing gender identity and gender expressions that are typical of the males that were there. People would say things to me oh, you can't do that. That's sexual.
Some of the habits Dr. Pfau picked up on were seen as atypical by their peers, which only left them more confused.
I couldn't twirl my sweatshirt that I'm wearing around my waist like it's a tutu. What's going on? Why?
They were part of a very conservative church group, which meant the queer community didn't even exist in their eyes.
Anyone who was queer or trans would eventually realize that that was wrong and, rejoin society, basically. And so little Daniel sort of grew up feeling like there was nothing like them. There was no outside example that they could sort of take in and say, like, this is how I feel, this is how I would like to express myself, this is how I feel authentic and safe.
But their research pointed to the conclusion that there was more to gender and identity than just male or female.
And so it was just like these mixed messages and feeling, honestly, like I had discovered a whole new world that no one wanted to talk about.
But Dr. Pfau didn't give up.
Biology is only as limited as the scientists who are creating it, in a sense. And so for me, like as little tiny biologist Daniel, I was like, oh my goodness, everyone's wrong. Why is no one watching these beetles like I am and realizing this?
When your biologist is like, there's these some species that don't have, male and female, and there's more of a spectrum. And you're like, I know one, it's humans. Did you know that? Like,
yes. No, it's so true.
That's a species.
Yes, exactly. And it's so weird because people will talk about it all the time, like, oh yeah, we're only talking about animals. And I'm like, okay. Am I not an animal?
Luckily, when they went off to college, the professors there were more willing to help them find the answers they were searching for. And it had a lot to do with
reproductive endocrinology, which is one of my most favorite things to talk about, which is basically just looking how our hormones influence our ability to sort of create these different aspects of our identity related to sex. So we have, and our physiology related to sex.
They had found their passion, but Dr. Pfau still worried others wouldn't take their work seriously because of how they identified.
Oh, but wait, no one's going to believe anything I talk about because I'm this queer individual and eventually would come out as genderqueer. And I felt like I just simply would be laughed at. And honestly, that does happen from time to time.
But they had had enough pushback for a lifetime and decided to look past that fear and just do it anyway.
My love for understanding these systems took over, and I was just like, no, I'm done caring about that. And so I'm sort of at this point in my life where I'm just like this neuroendocrinologist who sort of wants to do as much as I can to help the queer community to not even be shown to be supported through science, but to have science be there for them, have science address their needs, and to truly give them power in science as well.
We're not expecting everyone to just know what an endocrinologist is, so let's break it down.
Endocrinology is basically the study of hormones, and neuroendocrinology is sort of looking at how hormones and the nervous system interact. And I think it's fascinating because one of the things, these are really our two communication systems for the body, one of them being hormones, which are a chemical signal, and then the neurons and nervous system, which is all electrical signals. And we translate those signals between each other. So electrical signals become chemical signals, not only at the level of hormones, but, even between cells. If neurons are communicating with each other, it means they're transitioning an electrical signal into a chemical one in between themselves and the other neuron. And then that other neuron is able to take that information and make it into an electrical signal again. And so throughout the body, this is happening in like small scale and large scale all over the place. And I just find it fascinating how much communication is going on and just that diversity.
And it was this diversity that led Dr. Pfau to look outside of societal walls for their own identity.
Seeing how things can be so diverse, because, when you've got two systems that are communicating in all different kinds of ways, you get just all this diversity going on too.
Thanks for watching part 1 of our interview with Dr. Daniel Pfau. In part 2, we'll learn how the disappearance of a gene could explain the history of queer behavior.
Straw Hut Media.